The year is 1299, and a horizon black with dust and the rhythmic thunder of 200,000 Mongol warhorses is closing in on the city of Delhi. Behind these riders lies a trail of ash stretching from the Great Wall of China to the banks of the Danube. They are the Chagatai Khanate, the invincible successors of Genghis Khan, and they have come to erase India from the map. Every kingdom that stood in their path has been liquidated. Every city that resisted has been turned into a pyramid of skulls. The world has accepted a singular, terrifying truth: the Mongols cannot be stopped. But as the Mongol vanguard crests the hills of Kili, they see something that should not exist. They do not see a panicked, disorganized levy of feudal lords. They see a professional war machine waiting in perfect silence, a wall of armored elephants and disciplined infantry that does not flinch as the greatest cavalry force in human history charges toward them. This is the moment the Mongol myth of invincibility shattered forever. History tells us the Mongols were an unstoppable force of nature, but history is incomplete. On this day, one man, Alauddin Khalji, would prove that you do not defeat the Mongols with just steel and bravery. You defeat them with a system so brutal, so efficient, and so radical that it transformed an entire subcontinent into a fortress. How did a sultan who was feared as a tyrant by his own people become the only wall between the Mongol horde and the total destruction of the Indian heartland? How did he fund a standing army of nearly 500,000 men without bankrupting his empire? The answer is not found in the edge of a sword, but in the secret weapon that the Mongols never saw coming. It was a weapon forged in the grain markets of Delhi and the branding irons of the royal stables. In this deep dive, we are performing an autopsy on a superpower. We are going beyond the blood-soaked plains of Kili to uncover the military genius and the revolutionary economic reforms that allowed the Delhi Sultanate to do what the Jin dynasty, the Khwarezmian Empire, and the Kievan Rus could not. We will explore the tragic sacrifice of Zafar Khan, the man the Mongols feared more than death itself. We will break down the Dagh system, the medieval equivalent of a high-tech military registry, and we will reveal how state-controlled price regulations became a tool of national defense that starved the invaders while the defenders feasted. This is the story of how a medieval sultan militarized an entire society to survive an invasion that aimed for total conquest. If you think you know how the great empires of the world fell, you are missing the most important chapter. The victory at Kili was not won on the day of the charge. It was won in the ledgers of the administrators and the iron discipline of a formation that refused to break. Pay close attention, because the strategy used to crush the Mongol war machine remains one of the most masterfully executed defensive campaigns in the history of warfare. The gates of Delhi are closing, and the Mongol Khan is waiting. It is time to see how the unstoppable was finally broken. Imagine a horizon so thick with dust that the sun itself begins to fade into a sickly ochre. Beneath that cloud lies the most terrifying sound of the 13th century, the rhythmic thrum of 200,000 Mongol hooves. By the year 1299, the Mongol war machine had already devoured half the known world. From the scorched plains of China to the frozen forests of Russia and the gates of Central Europe, the successors of Genghis Khan were not just soldiers, they were a force of nature. They were the unstoppable tide, an army that did not know the meaning of defeat. Every kingdom that stood in their path had been ground into the dirt, their cities leveled and their populations erased. But as this tidal wave of steel and horsehide swept toward the fertile plains of northern India. It was about to collide with a man who had turned the act of survival into a cold, calculated science. Alauddin Khalji, the Sultan of Delhi, understood a truth that his contemporaries ignored. You could not defeat the Mongols with traditional chivalry or simple bravery. To break the unshakable, you had to become even more relentless than the nightmare at your gates. While the rest of the world trembled, Khalji was busy militarizing an entire civilization. He didn't just recruit soldiers, he engineered a society designed for total war. He implemented a revolutionary administrative system that would make modern logistics experts stare in awe. From the branding of every single battle horse to ensure no corruption could weaken his cavalry, to a state-controlled economic iron fist that dictated the price of every grain of rice and every yard of cloth, Khalji ensured his massive standing army was fed, armed, and ready, while the rest of the world starved under the weight of Mongol sieges. The Battle of Kili was the ultimate collision of these two ideologies. On one side, the mobile, fluid, and terrifyingly efficient light cavalry of the Chagatai Khanate, led by the ambitious Kutluk Khwaja. On the other, the disciplined, immovable formations of the Delhi Sultanate, backed by the sheer physical power of massive war elephants and a military machine fueled by the most sophisticated economic reforms of the medieval era. This was not just a fight for territory. This was a struggle for the very soul of the Indian subcontinent. If Delhi fell, the cultural and intellectual heart of the region would be extinguished forever. In this comprehensive deep dive, we are going inside the mind of a military genius who history often forgets. We will explore how the siege of Siri became a masterclass in defensive strategy, and why the tragic, suicidal charge of the legendary General Zafar Khan became the catalyst for a victory that echoed through the centuries. We will uncover how price controls and market regulations became more effective weapons than the sharpest swords, and how the myth of Mongol invincibility was finally, violently shattered on the outskirts of Delhi. This is the story of an empire that refused to break. This is the story of the Battle of Kili and the secret weapon that saved an entire civilization. Prepare yourself, because we are stepping into a time when the world was forged in blood and iron, and where one man decided that the unstoppable would finally be stopped. To understand the sheer magnitude of the threat facing India in 1299, you first have to understand the map of the world as it existed then. Imagine a stain of blood spreading across a parchment. That was the Mongol Empire. By the time the Chagatai Khanate turned its eyes toward the fertile plains of the Indo-Gangetic Basin, they were no longer the ragtag tribes of the steppe. They were a sophisticated, hyper-mobile genocide machine. They had already dismantled the Jin dynasty in China, leaving cities so full of corpses that the streets were greasy with human fat. They had sacked Baghdad, the intellectual jewel of the Islamic world, turning the Tigris River black with the ink of books and red with the blood of scholars. To the average person living in the 13th century, the Mongols were not men. They were the wrath of God. They were an existential ending. But India was different. For the Mongols, India was the ultimate prize. It was a land of unimaginable wealth of spice and gold, and millions of potential subjects. But it was also a logistical nightmare. The heat was stifling, the jungles were dense, and the geography was protected by the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush. Previous Mongol incursions had been raids for plunder, hitting the border regions and retreating with wagons full of loot. But 1299 was different. This was not a raid. This was an invasion of total replacement. When Kutluk Khwaja, the Mongol prince, led 200,000 horsemen toward Delhi, he did not stop to pillage the countryside. He bypassed the provincial forts. He ignored the easy targets. He drove his army straight for the heart. He wanted the capital. He wanted the throne. He wanted to turn the Delhi Sultanate into a graveyard. Inside the walls of Delhi, the atmosphere was one of pure, unadulterated terror. The city was overflowing with refugees who had seen their villages vanished in a cloud of dust. They brought stories of the Mongol composite bow that could outshoot any archer in the world, and the Mongol horsemen who could live in the saddle for days, drinking the blood of their own mounts to survive. The nobility of Delhi was paralyzed. Most of the Sultan's advisors were begging him to negotiate, to pay a tribute to buy their lives with gold and a promise of servitude. They argued that no one in history had ever beaten a full-scale Mongol invasion in a pitched battle. Resistance was not just risky, it was seen as a form of collective suicide. This is where the story usually focuses on the clash of steel, but to understand why Delhi survived, you have to look at the man sitting on the throne. Alauddin Khalji was not a man born to be a hero. He was a usurper who had murdered his own uncle to seize power. He was a man who was deeply hated and even more deeply feared by his own people. He was a tyrant who had crushed internal rebellions with a cruelty that matched the Mongols themselves. But Khalji possessed a cold, surgical clarity that his predecessors lacked. He realized that the traditional way of fighting wars, where noble lords gathered their local levies and rode out to meet the enemy, was a death sentence against the Mongols. The Mongols were a professional army. They were disciplined. They were a system. Khalji looked at his empire and saw a crumbling mess of corruption and inefficiency. He saw officers who stole from the treasury and soldiers who sold their best horses and replaced them with sick ponies. He saw a market where merchants hoarded grain to drive up prices during times of war, making it impossible to feed a large army. He knew that if he fought the Mongols as the Sultan of India, he would lose. To win, he had to become something else. He had to transform the entire Sultanate into a military barracks where every single resource was redirected toward one single goal: survival. He was going to build a machine to fight a machine. He began by doing the impossible. He raised a standing army of nearly 500,000 men. In the medieval world, this was a logistical absurdity. How do you pay 500,000 soldiers without the economy collapsing under the weight of taxes? How do you feed them when the enemy is burning the fields? Most historians focus on the arrows and the elephants, but the real battle was being fought in the ledgers of the royal accountants. Khalji launched a series of radical economic reforms that would make a modern socialist state look tame. He fixed the price of every essential commodity. Grain, cloth, sugar, cattle, even slaves had a price mandated by the state. He eliminated the middleman. He forced farmers to sell their surplus directly to state granaries. If a merchant was caught cheating on his scales, the law was simple. A piece of flesh equal to the weight of the missing grain would be cut from the merchant's body. This was the atmosphere in Delhi as the Mongol vanguard reached the plains of Kili. It was a city under the grip of a man who was prepared to mutilate his own people to ensure their survival. The Mongol prince Kutlugh Khwaja arrived at the gates expecting to find a city in chaos ready to break. He expected to find a sultan who would cower behind walls or offer a desperate bribe. Instead, he found a silent professional wall of steel. He found an army that had been paid in full fed by a state-controlled supply chain and mounted on horses that were branded and tracked by the royal bureaucracy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of South Asia for the next 300 years. But as the two massive armies faced each other across the dusty expanse of Kili, a strange realization began to ripple through the Mongol ranks. They had spent decades perfecting the art of the feigned retreat and the crushing ambush. They were used to fighting enemies who were either too brave or too stupid, who would break formation to chase them or flee in terror. But the army of Delhi did not move. They did not shout. They did not flinch. They stood in a silence so heavy it was deafening. And that is when the greatest mystery of the Battle of Kili begins to reveal itself. Because history has always recorded this as a story of a brave sultan defending his home, but when you look closer at the archives, you realize something terrifying. Alauddin Khalji wasn't just defending Delhi. He was using the Mongol invasion as a distraction for something far more calculated and far more sinister within his own ranks. The greatest threat to the Sultan that day wasn't the 200,000 Mongols in front of him. It was the man standing right next to him, his own most decorated general Zafar Khan. To understand why the year 1299 represents a fracture point in world history, we have to look at the terrifying efficiency of the Mongol war machine. By this era, the Mongol way of war had been perfected into a science of annihilation. They were not just a cavalry force, they were a psychological weapon. They traveled with minimal baggage, living off the land and the milk and blood of their horses, allowing them to move at speeds that shattered the medieval concept of distance. When they arrived at a city, the choice was binary surrender and become a vassal, or resist and be erased from the records of humanity. This was the dark shadow stretching across the Hindu Kush toward the Delhi Sultanate. Inside the palaces of Delhi, the air was thick with the smell of incense and the cold sweat of fear. The nobility of India were not warriors in the same mold as the steppe nomads. They were feudal lords who relied on complicated hierarchies of loyalty and slow-moving peasant levies. To them, the Mongol approach was alien and terrifying. The Mongols did not play by the rules of chivalry. They did not wait for formal challenges. They were a swarm that moved with the coordination of a single organism. The reports coming from the border were apocalyptic. Entire provinces were being bypassed. The Mongols under Kutlugh Khwaja weren't stopping to pillage. They were heading straight for the throat. This brings us to the central mystery of the Battle of Kili. Why did the Mongols, who had successfully sieged the most advanced fortifications in the world, fail to break a single city in northern India? The answer lies in the man who had just seized the throne through a bath of his own family blood. Alauddin Khalji was not a man of God or a man of tradition. He was a man of cold, brutal logic. He looked at the Mongol success and realized it was based on two things: absolute discipline and a limitless supply chain. If he wanted to survive, he had to build a system that was even more rigid and even more efficient. Most military commanders of the time focused on training their soldiers to swing swords. Khalji focused on the price of grain. He understood that a soldier who is hungry or whose family is starving at home is a soldier who will break under the pressure of a Mongol charge. In a move that was centuries ahead of its time, Khalji seized total control of the economy. He turned the entire Delhi Sultanate into a state-run warehouse. He established a network of government granaries and enacted the market regulations of Delhi. The price of every essential item was fixed by royal decree. If a merchant was caught charging a single copper coin more than the mandated price, or if his scales were uneven, the punishment was not a fine. The Sultan's officials would cut an equal weight of flesh from the merchant's body. This was not just cruelty, it was a message. The state was now the only force in the world more terrifying than the Mongols. But feeding an army was only half the battle. Khalji had to ensure that his army was actually a professional force and not a collection of corrupt officers and ghost soldiers. In the medieval world, it was common for commanders to claim they had 1,000 men, but only show up with 500, pocketing the extra pay for themselves. It was common for soldiers to ride their best horses for inspection and then sell them for profit, replacing them with sick ponies before the actual battle. To end this, Khalji introduced the Dagh system. Every single horse in the Sultanate's service was branded with a royal mark, and every soldier had his physical description recorded in a central registry. You could not cheat the system. You could not hide. For the first time in Indian history, a sultan had a standing army of nearly 500,000 men who were paid directly by the treasury, fed by the state, and mounted on horses that were tracked by the bureaucracy. As the Mongol vanguard finally reached the plains of Kili just outside Delhi, they expected to find the same thing they found everywhere else, a disorganized mess of desperate men. Instead, they found something that looked more like a Roman legion than a medieval army. They found a formation that stretched as far as the eye could see, perfectly synchronized and utterly silent. The Mongols relied on the terror of their arrival to break an enemy before the first arrow was even fired. But the soldiers of Delhi did not break. They had been hardened by a regime that was just as lethal as the one they were facing. They were more afraid of their sultan than they were of the Khan. The Mongol scouts watched from the ridges as the Delhi army moved into position. They saw the heavy infantry in the center, the mobile cavalry on the wings, and the massive war elephants acting as living fortresses. The Mongols had fought elephants before, but never in a system like this. These were not just animals. They were tactical units protected by iron plate and carrying towers filled with elite archers. The psychological advantage that the Mongols had held over the rest of the world for a century was evaporating in the heat of the Indian sun. However, as the sun began to set on the eve of the battle, a strange tension developed within the Delhi camp. While the world sees the Battle of Kili as a clash between two empires, the reality on the ground was far more complex. Alauddin Khalji was a man who trusted no one. He had built a system to survive the Mongols, but he had also built a system to ensure that no one else could ever challenge his power. While the Mongol prince Kutlu Khwaja was planning his charge, Khalji was looking at his own front lines with a different kind of fear. He saw his greatest general Zafar Khan, a man whose name alone made the Mongol horses bolt in terror. Zafar Khan was the hero the people loved, the warrior who had never lost a skirmish. And in the mind of a tyrant like Khalji, that made Zafar Khan more dangerous than the 200,000 Mongols across the field. The Mongol myth of invincibility was about to be shattered, but the blow would not come from the Sultan himself. It would come from a man who was intentionally being sent to his death by his own king. The Great Battle of Kili was not just a defense of a civilization, it was a cold-blooded execution of a rival disguised as a heroic sacrifice. While the arrows began to fly, the real betrayal was not happening between enemies, but between brothers in arms. The Mongols thought they were fighting an army, but they were actually walking into a trap where even the defenders were being played like pieces on a chessboard. This is the moment where the history of the Mongol conquest takes a turn that no one expected, because the man who saved India was the same man who was prepared to let his best soldiers die just to keep his throne secure. The morning sun baked the plains of Kili. 200,000 Mongols waited for the signal. On the right wing of the Delhi army stood Zafar Khan. He was the sword of the Sultanate. His name was a ghost story whispered in Mongol camps. He commanded the elite heavy cavalry. He was supposed to hold the line, but Zafar Khan did not wait. Without orders from the Sultan, he initiated a full frontal charge. He drove his heavy horsemen straight into the heart of the Mongol vanguard. It was an act of absolute madness. You do not charge the Mongols. You do not break formation. But Zafar Khan was not an ordinary man. His charge hit the Mongol line with the force of a meteor. The impossible happened. The Mongol front line collapsed. For the first time in a century, the successors of Genghis Khan were falling back in sheer panic. Zafar Khan cut through their ranks like a scythe through wheat. He pushed them back 1 mile, then 5 miles, then 10 miles. The Delhi soldiers cheered. They thought the battle was won. They were wrong. The Mongols were not fleeing. They were executing the Mongol. It was the deadliest tactical maneuver in military history, the feigned retreat. The Mongols wanted Zafar Khan to chase them. They wanted him to separate from the main army, and Zafar Khan took the bait. He chased the Mongol prince Kutlug Khwaja for 18 miles. The dust rose so high it blocked out the sun. When the dust finally settled, Zafar Khan realized he was completely alone. The Mongol retreat suddenly stopped. 10,000 Mongol horsemen wheeled around in perfect unison. They surrounded the Indian general. The trap was shut. Zafar Khan looked back toward the horizon. He expected to see the banners of Alauddin Khalji rushing to save him. He expected the left wing to close the gap, but the horizon was empty. Back at the main camp, Khalji watched the dust clouds in the distance.
Your Highness,
his generals begged him to send reinforcements. Khalji refused. He ordered the army to hold their ground. He was deliberately leaving his greatest hero to die. Zafar Khan knew he was betrayed. He knew he was breathing his last breaths. But he did not surrender. The Mongol prince offered him a chance to live. Kutlug Khwaja told Zafar Khan to kneel and join the Mongol Empire. Zafar Khan laughed. He drew his sword and ordered his surrounded men to attack. What followed was a massacre so brutal it scarred the Mongol psyche for generations. Zafar Khan and his heavy cavalry fought until their horses collapsed. Then they fought on foot. They fought until the arrows sticking out of their armor made them look like iron porcupines. Zafar Khan killed hundreds of Mongols with his own hands before he finally fell. The Mongols had their victory. They had killed the monster of Delhi, but the cost was catastrophic. The Mongol prince looked at the piles of dead bodies. He had lost thousands of his best men just to kill one isolated general. A chilling thought crept into the mind of Kutlug Khwaja. If a single cut-off commander could inflict this much damage, what would happen when they hit the main army? Zafar Khan was dead, but his sacrifice had broken the Mongol momentum. The fear that the Mongols usually inflicted on their enemies was now infecting their own ranks. But the battle was not over. The Mongols regrouped. They had 200,000 men. They turned their horses back toward Delhi. They were ready to wipe out Alauddin Khalji and finish the job. They expected the Indian army to be demoralized by the death of their champion. When the Mongols returned to the plains of Kili, they found something terrifying. The Delhi army had not moved a single inch. They stood in absolute silence. No weeping for Zafar Khan, no panic, just a wall of steel and tusks. Khalji had engineered a military machine devoid of emotion. Kutlug Khwaja ordered the ultimate charge. The ground shook as waves of light cavalry rained armor-piercing arrows down on the Indian lines. Normally, this barrage would turn an enemy formation to dust, but the Delhi infantry raised their heavy shields. The armor of the war elephants absorbed the arrows like rain. The Indian archers fired back, using heavy crossbows, that punched right through the Mongol leather armor. The Mongol charge hit the Indian line and shattered like water hitting a cliff. The Mongols tried to flank the army. They tried to use their speed, but everywhere they turned, they faced a heavily armored elephant. These beasts swung massive iron chains from their trunks. They crushed Mongol horses and riders under their feet. The Mongol ponies were terrified by the smell and sound of the elephants. The steppe cavalry lost control of their mounts. The unmatched mobility of the Chagatai Khanate was rendered useless. The battle devolved into a brutal, grinding melee, and this was exactly what Khalji wanted. In a slow, bloody brawl, his heavily armored troops had the advantage over the light steppe cavalry. The Mongols were bleeding out. Night fell on the plains of Kili. The Mongols pulled back. They had not broken the line. It was an unthinkable reality. For the first time, a massive Mongol invasion force had been halted in a pitched battle. But Kutluk Khwaja was not ready to give up. The Mongols could not win on the open field, but they still had the numbers. They decided to change their strategy. They surrounded the city of Delhi. They cut off the roads. They burned the surrounding farmland. They initiated a total siege. The Mongols knew they could not break the walls, but they knew they could starve the city. They planned to wait until the people of Delhi ate their own shoes and opened the gates in desperation. This is where the Mongol war machine met its true doom. This is where the genius of Alauddin Khalji fully materialized. The Mongols were waiting for Delhi to starve. But Delhi was not starving. Behind the high walls, the grain markets were full. The soldiers were eating fresh rations. The horses were fed. How was this possible? It was the result of the ruthless economic system Khalji had built years before the invasion. The state-owned granaries were packed to the ceiling with wheat and barley. The strict price controls meant there was no inflation. No merchant was allowed to hoard food. The supply chain was a closed loop controlled by the military. Khalji had turned his economy into an invincible fortress. While the defenders of Delhi feasted, the Mongols outside the walls began to starve. The Chagatai army had relied on living off the land, but they had already burned the fields around Delhi. There was no grass left for their 200,000 horses. The Indian summer was approaching. The heat was becoming unbearable. Sickness began to spread through the Mongol camp. The hunters had become the hunted. Kutluk Khwaja realized his terrifying army was trapped in a logistical nightmare. They were locked outside a city that refused to starve while their own men died of hunger and disease. The great Mongol siege had failed completely. The Sultan had calculated every single variable. He knew the Mongols relied on speed and terror. He took away their speed with his war elephants. He took away their terror with his iron discipline. And he took away their endurance with his ledgers and price controls. The Mongol prince had no choice. In the dead of night, the Chagatai Khanate did something they had never done before. They quietly broke camp and retreated. The unstoppable force slinked away in the darkness. They left behind thousands of dead warriors and shattered weapons. The invincible Mongols had been beaten not by a superior cavalry charge, but by a brutal autocrat who understood logistics better than anyone else in the medieval world. The survival of Delhi changed the course of global history. If Khalji had failed, India would have suffered the same fate as Baghdad or Kiev. The massive population centers of the subcontinent would have been wiped out. The rich cultural tapestry of the region would have been burned to ash. But because of a tyrant with a ledger, the heart of India kept beating. Alauddin Khalji saved his empire, but he cemented his legacy as a monster. He let his bravest general die. He mutilated his own merchants to keep grain prices low. He turned his nation into a prison camp just to keep the wolves outside the gates. The victory at Kili proved that sometimes the only way to defeat a nightmare is to become one yourself. But the Mongols were far from finished. The retreat of Kutlug Khwaja was just the end of the first round. The Chagatai Khanate would return, and the next time, they would not make the same mistakes. The true test of the Delhi Sultanate was only just beginning. The year was 1303. The Mongols were humiliated, but they were not broken. Kutlug Khwaja was dead, but the Chagatai Khanate had a new commander. His name was Targi. Targi looked at the disaster of Kili and realized exactly where the Mongols went wrong. They had treated Delhi like a traditional enemy. They brought their families and slow-moving baggage trains. They tried to fight a conventional war against an unconventional sultan. Targi stripped the Mongol army down to its bare bones. He wanted pure speed. He assembled 120,000 elite light cavalry. No baggage, no siege engines, just horses and bows. He did not march toward India. He sprinted. This speed caught Alauddin Khalji completely blind. The Sultan was not in Delhi. He was miles away, returning from a grueling campaign in the south. His army was exhausted. His treasury wagons were slow. The Mongol lightning strike bypassed every border fort. The warning beacons were not even lit before Targi crossed the river. Khalji scrambled to reach his capital, but he was too late. The Mongols had already completely surrounded the massive city. The Sultan was cut off from his own empire. He managed to slip into the heavily fortified citadel of Siri, just outside Delhi. But he was trapped. The master of logistics was now locked in a cage. The situation was catastrophic. The entire Mongol playbook had changed. Targi did not attack the walls. He did not challenge the elephants. He simply locked the doors to the city. The Mongols controlled every road in and out of the capital. They burned the supply lines. They slaughtered the reinforcement columns before they could even form up. Khalji had built a massive standing army, but that army was scattered across the subcontinent. Inside Siri Fort, the Sultan had only a fraction of his men. The defenders were vastly outnumbered. The trap was perfectly executed. But Targi underestimated the sheer paranoia of Alauddin Khalji. The Sultan had built Siri Fort for exactly this nightmare. It was not just a castle, it was a massive military bunker. Khalji had dug enormous reservoirs inside the walls to capture monsoon water. He had packed the underground vaults with grain. The Mongols thought they were starving out a desperate king. Instead, they were sitting outside a medieval doomsday shelter. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into months. The Mongols waited for the screams of starvation. They heard nothing but silence. The psychological toll began to shift. The Mongols were used to moving. They were a kinetic force. Sitting still in the sweltering Indian heat was a death sentence for steppe nomads. The land around Delhi was already picked clean. There was no grass for their horses. Disease began to rip through the Mongol camps. Targi watched his invincible cavalry turn into a sickly, desperate mob. 2 months passed. The Mongol commander realized he was repeating the exact same mistake as his predecessor. He was fighting the walls instead of the men. In a move that shocked the world, the Mongols packed up their tents and retreated in the middle of the night. The siege of Siri was over. Khalji survived, but the close call terrified him. He knew he could not rely on thick walls forever. The Mongols were learning. They were adapting. If they came back a third time, they would bring a force so massive that no fortress could hold them. The Sultan realized that playing defense was a slow form of suicide. He had to rewrite the rules of medieval warfare. He had to take the fight to the most dangerous empire on earth. The Sultan ordered a massive overhaul of his border security. He rebuilt the ruined forts along the Indus River. He stationed his most brutal commanders in the danger zones. But walls and guards were not enough. Khalji needed a way to predict the Mongol movements. He built an intelligence network that spanned the entire region. He planted spies deep inside Mongol territory. He knew exactly when the Mongol horses were being saddled. He knew exactly what routes they would take. The element of surprise was completely eliminated. The Mongols had lost their greatest weapon. To fund this massive expansion, Khalji pushed his economic controls to absolute extremes. He squeezed every ounce of wealth from his nobility. He banned private gatherings and strictly controlled the sale of alcohol to prevent any rebellions. The treasury swelled with gold. The Sultan used this money to manufacture thousands of new weapons. Blacksmiths worked day and night producing heavy armor and armor-piercing arrows. Khalji was no longer just preparing to survive. He was preparing to conquer. When the Mongols returned in 1305, they walked into a slaughterhouse. An army of 50,000 Mongol riders crossed the border expecting an easy raid. They did not find panicked villagers. They found an empty landscape. The fields were already burned by the Indians themselves. The wells were poisoned. Khalji had ordered a scorched earth policy. The Mongols rode deeper into the wasteland. They were thirsty and exhausted. And that is when the trap snapped shut. 30,000 elite heavy cavalry of the Delhi Sultanate materialized from the dust. They were led by Malik Nayak, a brilliant general who served the Sultan. Nayak did not wait for the Mongols to form up. He launched a massive preemptive strike. The tired Mongol ponies were no match for the armored Indian warhorses. The battle was an absolute massacre. The Delhi army hunted the retreating Mongols for miles. They captured thousands of prisoners. Khalji ordered the prisoners brought to Delhi. He wanted to send a message that would echo all the way to the steppes of Mongolia. The Sultan ordered the execution of every single Mongol captive, but he did not just kill them. He used their skulls to build an enormous tower outside the gates of his city. He wanted the next Mongol army to see exactly what waited for them in India. It was a brutal, barbaric display of power, and it worked. The psychological terror that the Mongols had inflicted on the world was finally turned back on them. The hunters had become the prey. The Chagatai Khanate was paralyzed by fear. But Khalji was not done. In 1306, the Mongols made one final desperate attempt to break the Sultanate. They sent their most experienced generals to crush the Indian resistance. They marched a massive army toward the Ravi River. Khalji sent his greatest tactician Malik Kafur to meet them. Kafur did not just defeat the Mongols, he annihilated them. He surrounded their camp in the dead of night and slaughtered the commanders in their tents. The mighty Mongol war machine was utterly dismantled. The dynamic shifted permanently. Alauddin Khalji ordered his generals to cross the border. The army of Delhi marched into Mongol territory. They burned Mongol cities. They raided Mongol camps. For the first time in history, a sedentary empire was actively hunting the nomads of the steppe. The Chagatai Khanate was forced onto the defensive. They had to build walls to protect themselves from the wrath of Delhi. The unstoppable force of nature had been beaten into submission. The survival of India was secured by a man who defied every convention of his time. Alauddin Khalji was a tyrant. He was a murderer. He squeezed his own people dry to fund his war machine. But he was exactly the monster that India needed. He proved that an invincible army could be broken by a superior system. He showed the world that logistics intelligence and sheer brutality could stop the apocalypse. The Mongols conquered the world, but they broke their teeth on the gates of Delhi. The map of Asia was forever changed because one man decided that he would not yield. But defeating the Mongols created a new, terrifying problem. You do not just build a military machine of 500,000 men and turn it off when the war is over. A machine of that size needs fuel. It needs momentum. And most importantly, it needs an enemy. When the Chagatai Khanate retreated, the Sultanate of Delhi did not celebrate. They held their breath. Alauddin Khalji had built a fortress to keep the monsters out. But now the people of India were trapped inside that fortress with him. The Mongols were gone. The Sultan was still there, and his paranoia was about to reach an apocalyptic level. History often ends the story at the victory, but the true climax of Khalji's reign happened in the shadows of his own court. He had defeated the greatest external threat the world had ever seen. Now, he turned his eyes inward. He looked at his nobles. He looked at his merchants. He looked at his own family. He saw treason everywhere. If the Mongols could not destroy his empire, he was convinced his own people would. So he launched the final phase of his master plan. He did not just want to control the economy anymore. He wanted to control the minds of his subjects. He created the Burids. They were a network of spies so extensive and so ruthless, they made modern surveillance states look blind. Khalji placed a spy in every market, in every military camp, and in the homes of his own generals. But he did not stop there. He created a second layer of spies to spy on the first layer, and then a third layer. Children were paid to listen to their parents. Servants were rewarded for betraying their masters. The streets of Delhi went completely silent. You could not speak to your neighbor. You could not complain about the weather, because anything could be interpreted as treason. The punishment was always the same: death by trampling under the feet of the royal elephants. The nobles of Delhi were stripped of all their wealth. Khalji knew that money bred ambition, so he made sure no one had any. He outlawed private parties. He banned alcohol. He made it illegal for two noble families to arrange a marriage without his direct permission. He severed the social bonds that could unite people against him. The Sultanate was no longer a kingdom. It was a military prison camp disguised as an empire. And the price controls that had saved them during the sieges, they became a suffocating noose. Merchants lived in absolute terror. The state sent young boys into the markets to buy bread. If a baker sold a loaf that was even 1 ounce too light, the spies would report him. The king's guards would arrive and slice the missing weight in flesh directly from the baker's thighs. Fear became the only currency that mattered, but the most chilling act of his reign was yet to come. It is an event that historians whisper about because it reveals the absolute darkness in Khalji's soul. During the years of the Mongol invasions, thousands of Mongol soldiers had actually defected to Delhi. They converted to Islam. They were known as the New Muslims. They lived in the capital. They fought for the Sultan. They had helped defend the city against their own cousins. But Khalji did not care. In his mind, a Mongol was always a Mongol. He believed they were a dormant disease waiting to strike. In the year 1311, he made a decision that rivaled the cruelty of Genghis Khan himself. He issued a secret order to his commanders. It was to be executed simultaneously across the entire empire. In a single day, 30,000 new Muslims were dragged from their homes. They were not given a trial. They were not allowed to speak. They were slaughtered in the streets. Their wives and children were sold into slavery. Their property was absorbed into the royal treasury. The streets of Delhi ran black with blood. Khalji did this not to win a war, but simply to clear his mind of a paranoid thought. The savior of India had become the very butcher he swore to destroy. When the news of the Mongol defeats and the brutal purges reached the rest of the world, no one could believe it. In the ashes of Baghdad and the ruined cities of Eastern Europe, kings and scholars whispered about the Sultan of Delhi. They wondered what kind of magic he possessed. They did not know it was not magic. It was pure mathematics. The Dagh system, the branding of horses, was so effective that later empires copied it. The Mughals would use it. The British would study it. Khalji proved that a bureaucracy could be deadlier than a cavalry charge, but the bureaucracy required a master to run it. This was the ultimate cost of stopping the unstoppable. To defeat a machine of pure violence, Khalji had to burn away his own humanity. He sacrificed his best general Zafar Khan. He mutilated his own merchants. He massacred his own loyal soldiers. He saved the physical land of India, but he broke its spirit. And the universe has a strange way of balancing the scales. The man who controlled everything eventually lost control of his own body. In his final years, the Iron Sultan began to rot. His body swelled with an agonizing disease. His mind fractured. The brilliant tactician who outsmarted the Chagatai Khanate was reduced to a paranoid shell. He trusted no one except Malik Kafur. Kafur was the brilliant general who had crushed the Mongols at the Ravi River. But Kafur was also deeply ambitious. He isolated the dying sultan. He executed Khalji's loyal ministers. He blinded Khalji's sons. The mighty Alauddin Khalji, the man who stared down 200,000 Mongol warriors, spent his final days locked in a dark room. He was a prisoner in the very palace he built to keep the world out. Many historians believe Kafur slowly poisoned him to death. The protector of the realm died alone, shivering and terrified. The moment Khalji died, the iron grip released. The economy collapsed. The fake prices shattered. The empire he built to last 1,000 years immediately plunged into civil war. Within a few short years, his entire bloodline was wiped out. His dynasty was erased. It seemed as though his brutal system was a massive failure. But when you look at the grand timeline of human history, a different truth emerges. His empire fell, but his mission succeeded. Alauddin Khalji bought India something that no other civilization got: time. The years he spent holding the line were the exact years the Chagatai Khanate needed to fracture. While Khalji was building his doomsday defense, the Mongol princes began fighting each other. The golden age of a unified Mongol war machine was over. They would never again mount a full-scale invasion of the Indian heartland. Khalji acted as the brutal dam that held back a tidal wave. By the time the dam finally broke, the water had already dried up. The Battle of Kili, the siege of Siri, the massacres, and the ledgers. They all point to a singular terrifying lesson about the nature of survival. Sometimes the hero of the story does not wear shining armor. Sometimes the hero is a monster who happens to be fighting an even bigger monster. We remember the Mongols for their speed, their terror, and their mountains of skulls. But we must also remember the man who looked at that nightmare and refused to blink. Alauddin Khalji built a system of pure mathematical cruelty. He starved the invaders. He tracked every horse. He fixed every price. He broke the rules of medieval warfare and dragged his empire into a modern age of total war. The next time you hear about the unstoppable armies of the past, remember that nothing is truly unstoppable. Every system has a flaw. Every war machine has a breaking point. It just takes someone ruthless enough to find it. The dust of the Mongol horses has long settled. The granaries of Delhi have crumbled to stone. But the echo of that silent, disciplined army at Kili still rings through time. It is a reminder that when the apocalypse comes knocking, it is not bravery that saves the world. It is discipline. It is logistics. And it is the absolute, terrifying will to survive. To understand how a single empire stopped the greatest war machine in history, you have to freeze time on the battlefield. Look closely at the clash between the Mongol light cavalry and the Delhi vanguard. The Mongol composite bow was a weapon of mass destruction. It had a draw weight of over 160 pounds. It could fire arrows that punched right through the chainmail of European knights and the heavy armor of the Middle East. So why did these arrows bounce off the soldiers of Alauddin Khalji? The answer is hidden in the dirt of the Indian subcontinent. It is a secret known as Wootz steel. While the Mongols conquered through mobility, the Indians had mastered metallurgy. The Delhi heavy infantry wore armor forged from crucible steel. This was a high-carbon metal that was incredibly flexible, but harder than anything the Mongols had ever faced. When a Mongol armor-piercing arrow hit a Delhi breastplate, it did not penetrate. It shattered. The Mongols were firing their absolute best weapons and hitting a literal wall of advanced medieval engineering. But defense alone does not win a war. You need a hammer to crush the enemy. Khalji had the ultimate hammer. History books often treat war elephants as clumsy beasts that easily panicked. The Mongols certainly thought so. They had fought elephants in Burma and crushed them using fire and noise. But the elephants of the Delhi Sultanate were not just animals. They were heavily modified siege engines. Let us look at the anatomy of a Khalji war elephant. These beasts were covered from head to toe in interlocking plates of steel. Their tusks were fitted with 3-foot-long poison-tipped iron blades. But the real genius was the tactical formation. Khalji did not send his elephants out alone. Each elephant was accompanied by a squad of elite infantry known as the Paiks. The Paiks were bound to the elephant. Their only job was to protect the legs and the underbelly of the beast from Mongol lancers. This meant the Mongol strategy of hamstringing the elephants was completely neutralized. On top of the elephant was a wooden tower, reinforced with iron. Inside this tower sat 3 archers, armed with the deadliest ranged weapon in the Indian arsenal, the giant crossbow. These were not handheld weapons. They were massive, heavy-draw crossbows that required the shooter to use both feet to pull back the string. The high vantage point of the elephant gave these snipers a clear line of sight over the dust of the battlefield. They were picking off Mongol commanders from 100 yards away. The Mongol horsemen relied on swarm tactics. They wanted to circle the enemy and rain arrows down in a continuous loop. But you cannot circle a moving fortress. Every time the Mongols tried to group together, an armored elephant would crash into their lines. The kinetic energy of a fully armored elephant charging at 15 miles per hour is roughly equivalent to a modern freight train. Mongol horses were completely shattered on impact. Riders were thrown into the air and trampled into the dust. The steppe ponies simply refused to charge. The smell of the elephants, the deafening sound of their trumpeting, and the sheer scale of the beasts broke the psychological conditioning of the Mongol horses. For the first time in their lives, the Mongols were facing an enemy they could not outrun and could not outgun. But Khalji knew that battlefield tactics were only a temporary fix. The Mongols would eventually adapt. They always did. To win the long war, he had to break their ability to replenish their forces. He had to attack their economy. Most historians look at Khalji's market reforms as a way to feed his own army. But there was a darker, more offensive purpose to the price controls. It was a strategy of economic starvation directed outward. The Mongols relied on local merchants and smugglers to supply their massive armies during long campaigns. They bought grain horses and weapons from corrupt border lords. Khalji shut this down completely. He nationalized the entire trade network. No merchant was allowed to travel outside the borders of the Sultanate without royal permission. Every single grain of wheat was tracked. This meant that when the Mongols crossed the Hindu Kush, they entered an absolute economic void. There were no black markets. There were no smugglers to bribe. The Mongols had all the looted gold of China and Persia in their saddlebags, but in the plains of northern India, their gold was useless. You cannot eat gold. This was the true genius of the Dagh system and the market regulations. Khalji turned the entire Indian economy into a weapon of mass starvation. When the Mongol commander Targi surrounded Siri fort, he expected the local Indian merchants to eventually smuggle food out to his camp for a high price. That is how sieges worked in the medieval world. Greed always beat loyalty. But Khalji had removed greed from the equation. He replaced it with pure terror. A merchant knew that if he sold a single loaf of bread to a Mongol scout, the Barids would find out. And the punishment was not just the death of the merchant. It was the execution of his entire extended family. Faced with the choice between Mongol gold and Khalji's executioners, the merchants chose to let the Mongols starve. The Chagatai Khanate bled to death not by the sword, but by the ledger. The Barids, the network of spies, operated with a terrifying efficiency that predicted every Mongol move. We must understand how these spies communicated. They did not rely on slow horses. Khalji established a relay system of runners and fast postal horses stationed every few miles across the empire. A message could travel from the border of Afghanistan to the capital in Delhi in a matter of days, a speed that was unheard of in the 13th century. Before a Mongol raiding party even crossed the river, Khalji already knew their numbers, their commanders, and their route. He would dispatch Malik Kafur or Ghazi Malik to a specific valley and simply wait. The Mongols were walking into ambushes that were mathematically planned weeks in advance. It was the medieval equivalent of satellite surveillance. The psychological toll on the Mongols was devastating. They were a people who believed they had a divine mandate to conquer the world. Genghis Khan had told them they were the punishment of God. But in the sweltering heat of India, they were being slaughtered by an enemy that seemed to know their every thought. They were fighting ghosts. They were fighting a machine. The commanders of the Chagatai Khanate began to turn on each other. Paranoia infected the Mongol camps. They started executing their own scouts, accusing them of being double agents for Delhi. Khalji's system had done the impossible. It had made the Mongols afraid of the dark. This is the turning point of the 13th century. The great Mongol war machine, the entity that erased the Kievan Rus, destroyed the Song dynasty, and crushed the Islamic Golden Age, finally snapped. The sheer density of the Delhi Sultanate, its unbreakable armor, its weaponized economy, and its ruthless administration formed an impenetrable shield. But this shield was heavy. The sheer amount of blood and gold required to maintain this system was draining the life out of India. Khalji had built a military state so tightly wound that it was on the verge of snapping itself.
The city is lost.
Every resource was diverted to the army. Art, literature, and culture stalled. The people of Delhi lived in a state of constant anxiety. They were safe from the Mongols, but they were captives of their own savior. This presents the ultimate paradox of Alauddin Khalji's reign. Was the price of survival worth it? To stop an empire of monsters, he had to strip away the very humanity of his own empire. He turned his citizens into gears in a military machine. He demanded absolute perfection, and he punished failure with extreme violence. The history of war teaches us that a defensive strategy cannot last forever without changing the defender. The Delhi Sultanate did not just beat the Mongols, they absorbed their cruelty. They became them. As the final Mongol forces retreated beyond the mountains, leaving their dead to rot in the sun, the map of the world was secured. Europe owes its survival to the freezing winters of Russia, but South Asia owes its survival to the cold, calculating mind of a tyrant. A man who looked at the apocalypse and decided to outwork it. This is the unseen reality of medieval warfare. It is not fought with honor. It is fought with supply chains, intelligence networks, and the sheer brutal will to outlast your enemy. The Mongols met their match not in a better warrior, but in a superior system. The true resolution of the Mongol threat did not come from a single hero, but from the cold realization that the era of the nomadic superstar was over. For a century, the world had tried to fight the Mongols by being braver, more honorable, or more desperate. Alauddin Khalji was the first ruler to realize that you do not fight a storm with a sword. You fight a storm by building a wall that is heavier than the wind. This was the core answer to the mystery of the Battle of Kili. The secret weapon that the Mongols never saw coming was not a new type of steel, but the total mobilization of an entire civilization into a single, functioning military organ. History has spent centuries obsessed with the flash of the blade, but the victory at Delhi was won in the silent grind of the administration. By the time the final Mongol invasion force retreated in 1306, they were not just beaten in battle, they were conceptually broken. They had encountered an enemy that they could not starve, an enemy that knew their movements before they made them, and an enemy that was more willing to be brutal to its own people than the Mongols were to their captives. This was the ultimate price of survival. To save the soul of India, Khalji had to temporarily extinguish its freedom. He turned the fertile plains of the north into a high-security garrison where every grain of rice served the army and every breath was monitored by the state. We must close the loop on the tragic sacrifice of Zafar Khan. While he died alone on the plains of Kili, his death was the psychological turning point of the entire conflict. He proved that a single Indian commander could outfight the Mongol vanguard, and his martyrdom became the fire that hardened the resolve of the Delhi infantry. But more importantly, his death allowed Khalji to consolidate absolute power. By removing his greatest rival while simultaneously defeating his greatest enemy, Khalji achieved a level of control that no Indian ruler had ever possessed. He used that power to build the defensive network that finally ended the Mongol era of expansion. The Mongol myth of invincibility did not just fade away, it was violently dismantled. The successes at the Ravi River and the siege of Siri proved that the Mongol light cavalry could be neutralized by a combination of heavy armor war elephants and scorched earth logistics. When the Chagatai Khanate eventually fractured into warring tribes, they did so because they had finally hit a barrier they could not climb. India remained the great unconquered prize. The cultural, intellectual, and religious heart of the subcontinent was preserved because one man was willing to become a monster to fight a nightmare. This is the most satisfying truth of the Battle of Kili. The Mongols were a force of nature, but systems are stronger than nature. Discipline is more enduring than terror, and logistics is the ultimate arbiter of history. Alauddin Khalji was a tyrant and a butcher, but he was also the architect of a survival strategy that remains one of the most masterfully executed campaigns in human history. He proved that when the unstoppable meets the unbreakable, the world changes forever. The gates of Delhi stayed closed, and the light of a civilization continued to burn because a machine of blood and iron stood guard in the dark. The Mongol tide had finally reached its high water mark, and for the first time in history, it was forced to recede. The true resolution of the Mongol threat did not come from a single heroic charge or a legendary warrior. For a century, the world had tried to fight the Mongols by being braver, more honorable, or more desperate. Alauddin Khalji was the first ruler to understand that you do not fight a storm with a sword. You fight a storm by building a wall heavier than the wind itself. This was the core answer to the mystery of the Battle of Kili. The secret weapon that the Mongols never saw coming was not a new type of steel, but the total mobilization of an entire civilization into a single, functioning military organ. History has spent centuries obsessed with the flash of the blade, but the victory at Delhi was won in the silent, relentless grind of administration. By the time the final Mongol invasion force retreated in 1306, they were not just beaten in battle. They were conceptually broken. They had encountered an enemy they could not starve, an enemy who knew their movements before they made them, and an enemy who was ultimately more willing to be brutal to its own people than the Mongols were to their captives. This was the ultimate price of survival. To save the physical land of India, Khalji had to temporarily extinguish its freedom, transforming the fertile plains of the north into a high-security garrison where every grain of rice served the army and every breath was monitored by the state. We must now truly close the loop on the tragic sacrifice of Zafar Khan. While he died alone on the plains of Kili, his death was far more than a simple battlefield loss. It was the psychological turning point of the entire conflict, proving that a single Indian commander could outfight the Mongol vanguard. His martyrdom became the fire that hardened the resolve of the Delhi infantry, making them impervious to terror. But more importantly, his death allowed Khalji to consolidate absolute power. By removing his greatest rival while simultaneously crippling his greatest enemy, Khalji achieved a level of unchallengeable control that no Indian ruler had ever possessed. He used that terrifying power to build the defensive network that finally, irrevocably, ended the Mongol era of expansion into India. The Mongol myth of invincibility did not just fade away, it was violently dismantled. The successes at the Ravi River and the siege of Siri proved unequivocally that the Mongol light cavalry, once thought unstoppable, could be neutralized by a combination of heavy armor, weaponized war elephants, and a scorched earth logistics strategy. When the Chagatai Khanate eventually fractured into warring tribes, they did so because they had finally hit a barrier they could not climb, an opponent they could not break. India remained the great, unconquered prize. The cultural, intellectual, and religious heart of the subcontinent was preserved, beating on, because one man was willing to become a monster to fight a nightmare. This is the most satisfying, and perhaps the most uncomfortable, truth of the Battle of Kili. The Mongols were indeed a force of nature, a terrifying elemental tide of destruction. But systems are stronger than nature. Discipline is more enduring than terror, and logistics is the ultimate arbiter of history. Alauddin Khalji was a tyrant and a butcher, yes, but he was also the architect of a survival strategy that remains one of the most masterfully executed campaigns in human history. He proved that when the unstoppable meets the unbreakable, the world changes forever. The gates of Delhi stayed closed, and the light of a civilization continued to burn, not because of divine intervention, but because a machine of blood and iron stood guard in the dark. The Mongol tide had finally reached its high water mark, and for the first time in history, it was forced to recede. It is a profound reminder that when the apocalypse comes knocking, it is not just bravery that saves the world. It is meticulous discipline, ingenious logistics, and the absolute, terrifying will to survive. The story of the Battle of Kili is more than a footnote in a dusty chronicle. It is a profound meditation on the nature of power and the terrifying price of survival. When we look back at the 13th century, we see a world being rewritten in fire. Great dynasties that had stood for centuries vanished in weeks. But at the gates of Delhi, the ink of history refused to dry. The most important lesson we take from the reign of Alauddin Khalji is that an unstoppable force is only unstoppable until it meets a superior system. The Mongols represented the pinnacle of nomadic warfare, a kinetic energy that fed on chaos and speed. Khalji countered them not with more speed, but with the cold, immovable weight of bureaucracy. He proved that a well-managed ledger can be more lethal than 1,000 arrows. We are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. In our search for heroes, we often look for men of pure virtue. But the man who saved the Indian heartland from total erasure was a tyrant who ruled through fear. This is the paradox of the protector. To stop an empire of nightmares, Khalji had to transform his own society into something equally formidable and equally grim. He militarized every facet of life, from the grain in the market to the horses in the stable. He understood that when the stakes are existential, there is no such thing as a partial effort. You either build a system capable of total resistance, or you prepare for total destruction. The victory at Kili was a triumph of discipline over instinct, showing us that organization is the ultimate equalizer against raw elemental power. Think about the world we live in today. We still face challenges that seem insurmountable. Forces that move with the speed and unpredictability of a Mongol charge. The legacy of the Delhi Sultanate tells us that these forces are not acts of God. They are variables in an equation that can be solved. By focusing on logistics, intelligence, and the rigid application of a plan, a smaller, more focused entity can halt a giant. The walls of Siri and the branded horses of the Dagh system are early blueprints for modern statecraft and strategic defense. They remind us that the foundation of any great achievement is not just the bravery of the soldiers on the front line, but the integrity of the system, supporting them from behind. But perhaps the most inspiring realization is that history is not inevitable. In 1299, every expert, every noble, and every king believed the Mongols could not be beaten. They had accepted defeat as a mathematical certainty. Alauddin Khalji was the only one who looked at the apocalypse and saw a logistical problem. He refused to accept the narrative of his time. By doing so, he preserved the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual identity of a subcontinent. Because he stood his ground, the traditions, the languages, and the stories of India were not lost to the flames. They survived to shape the world we know. The echo of the hooves at Kili still speaks to us. It tells us that no matter how dark the horizon looks, no matter how loud the thunder of the approaching enemy becomes, the tide can be turned. It takes a willingness to adapt, a commitment to absolute discipline, and the courage to build something unbreakable. The Mongols conquered the world, but they could not conquer the man who turned his empire into a machine of survival. This is the ultimate testament to human agency. We are not just leaves in the wind of history. We are the architects of the walls that stand against the storm. The unstoppable was broken not by luck, but by the sheer, calculated will of a civilization that refused to die. The survival of India was not a miracle, but a masterclass in the mechanics of power. If you recognize that the world is built on these invisible systems of logistics and discipline rather than simple fate, then you are exactly who this channel is for. We are deconstructing the most complex survival strategies in history to reveal how the impossible was made inevitable through the sheer weight of administrative will. By subscribing, you ensure that the deep archives of human strategy remain open and that we can continue to perform these autopsies on the empires that shaped our reality. But the Mongol shadow reached far beyond the Indian heartland. To see what happens when a system fails to adapt and when there is no cold strategist like Khalji to hold the line, you need to witness the tragic end of the Khwarezmian Empire. Click the video on your screen now to see how a single diplomatic error and a lack of systemic discipline allowed Genghis Khan to erase a superpower from the map in just 2 years. The next chapter of the Mongol conquest is waiting.